So today I'm with Labour councillor Darragh Moriarty. Darragh, thanks so much for joining me here.
Thanks for having us.
So Darragh, I'm going to jump right into it. You are a councillor for Dublin 8, isn't that correct?
Yeah, so it's the Southwest Inner City Ward, it's called, and it encompasses most of Dublin 8. So it goes, if your listeners are familiar with Christchurch, it goes right down Christchurch, Patrick Street, Clonbrazil Street to the canal, and then it sweeps right across South Circular Road, the Tenters, takes in Dolphins Barn, the Liberties, big part of my ward is the Liberties, and then Inchicore, Kilmaine and Rialto. So it's kind of very working class community. It's been through a lot of transition in recent years and decades. And then the kind of little part of Dublin 8 that I don't represent is kind of Kevin Street, Portobello. That's in a different ward. But generically I say Dublin 8, and then sometimes I get contacted by people on Whitefire Street, Angel Street, and I say, no, sorry, that's not that part of Dublin 8. So, but most of Dublin 8. So yeah, it's a brilliant place to represent. I'm from there. I grew up in Dolphins Barn, right at the Coombe Hospital. I'm sure many of your listeners were born in the Coombe Hospital or know people who were born in the Coombe Hospital. So my family had a little shop right opposite the Coombe. We lived over that shop. So we're very embedded in the community. And I suppose now I still live in Dublin 8. So I live up in Inchicore, so I haven't gone very far from where I was born and reared. And it's a huge privilege to represent the Southwest Inner City.
Okay. So yeah, you're born and bred in the area. So kind of tailor-made then to be a councillor. And what made you want to become a councillor?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I suppose growing up in that community, as I got older, as I became more aware of, how things worked in the world, you kind of saw that certain parts of Dublin had things and other parts had better resources and access to facilities and so on compared to what we had. I was always politically engaged. I was always politically interested. I went to school in Sink Street, which is down in not in my part of Dublin 8, down in Harrington Street, Sink Street area, and that was a brilliant foundation for me to kind of see a whole different part of Dublin. You had people who were doing very well in school side by side with people who maybe weren't, who are coming from very vulnerable and disadvantaged backgrounds and situations. My parents worked 14-hour days in our shop in a small business. We were a small employer. My dad had 2-3 staff working for him. I worked in the shop. But then around you then, a lot of people living in their own homes, people living in social housing. And I think being in that community and seeing the kind of disadvantage up close and sort of being on the cusp of myself at times just gave you a different outlook on the world. And when you're studying politics, you kind of lean a certain way. And honestly, I was kind of happy having an interest in politics and being politically engaged without actually being party political. And it was only after being introduced to my then local councillor, who was Rebecca Moynihan at the time. She was from Rialto. She was from Dublin 8. She was, from my area, and she represented my community on Dublin City Council. And I got introduced to her, and I kind of started campaigning with her. Hadn't signed up to be a party member at that stage. Was still kind of just supporting her as a candidate. And I think that's what happens in politics a lot. Party membership is in decline. Not many people are signing up to be members of parties anymore, but people get attracted to candidates and their vision, their mission. And I suppose it was Rebecca in the first instance and her vision for a better Dublin 8, better community facilities, better green spaces, parks, higher quality of housing. All of that was kind of rubbing off on me. And then she ended up going to become a senator, and the seat became available. At that stage when the seat became available, I suppose, if your listeners aren't familiar with how co-options and local authorities work, if someone leaves a seat in the Dáil, we have a by-election. We don't do by-elections at local authority level on local councils, so it's a co-option. So I wasn't even a Labour Party member when the question got asked, would you be interested in going for that? And I had to think long and hard about it because, as I said, I'd always had an interest in politics, but I'd never kind of nailed colours to a party. Even though I was supportive of Rebecca, I hadn't taken the jump to become a fully fledged party member. So this was a real kind of choice for me to make about whether or not it was something I wanted to do. It was June 2020 when I became a councillor. There was something going on in the world at that time that people might remember, which was the pandemic. So, I went for it because I really did feel that, particularly younger people in politics needed to be represented. I was 25 in 2020. I was a very young councillor becoming a local representative. And I thought, continuing the tradition of Rebecca being from Rialto, me being from Dolphins Barn, me knowing the Dublin 8 area so well, I wanted that continuity, that somebody would understand that community to represent it. I think it's really, really important. That doesn't mean that you have to be born and bred in Dublin 8 to represent it. There's representatives now who I laugh at and say they're blow-ins, but they do great jobs. But they've made Dublin 8 their adopted home, you know, and that's a big thing about Dublin 8. There's so many people who are, you know, literally born in the Cumin and live across the road from it all their life. And then there's people who've made it their home now from all over Ireland. You know, there's a huge kind of culture contingent in Dublin 8. And as well as that, then, you know, you have a lot of people from outside Ireland who've made Dublin 8 their home. So it's a real melting pot. And I wanted to make sure that someone got that community that was representing it. So I went forward. I was supported by the party membership. I had to become a party member. And then I became a councillor. So it was all very quickly. It all happened very quickly. And yeah, I'm delighted I've done it. It's been a huge step for me, kind of professionally, because obviously, you know, you're working, and a councillor role is a part-time role. Really, it's supposed to be a part-time role. So, you know, at the time I had a full-time job. I had to kind of negotiate that with my employer, and then since then I've kind of moved jobs once or twice. And again, you carry that with you, that you're having to kind of say, and by the way, I have this other this other activity that I do that takes up a lot of my time and energy. So can you accommodate that? So it's an interesting dynamic. And then as a younger person, you know, colliding with housing, colliding with, you know, starting a family, things like that are all happening. And I just thought it was really important that young people were represented in politics, because councillors, you know, they're kind of a fast track into the Oireachtas, or there's a lot of people maybe who are older who don't necessarily have the same pressures of a day job, and that squeezes views out, squeezes people out who could access and be a voice for their community. So yeah, so June 2020 I became a councillor. I spent the first 18 months behind the screen on my laptop. You know, meetings were remote. It was such a strange experience because, you know, nobody in Dublin 8 probably knew that I was the councillor because I couldn't get out and meet people. I couldn't be at events. I couldn't knock on doors. So it was very strange. So kind of, you know, into 22, really, when the restrictions started to ease. Sorry to bring listeners back to COVID, but if you can remember that time, we were in and out of lockdowns, in and out of restrictions. So you were kind of dropping introductory leaflets going, hello, I'm your councillor, you know, 18 months after the fact. So it was a very strange experience. So that's my journey into becoming a councillor.
That's like, just that you mentioned with COVID, it must have been really hard to stay connected with all of the people in your ward, you know, by saying, oh, by the way, I've been your councillor for the last 18 months.
Absolutely, yeah, it was. And I think that's a huge issue with co-options in general. Yeah. If you think of an election cycle, if you think of the posters, if you think of the kind of the leaflets, and some listeners might call junk mail that comes in the letterbox, and the knocking on the doors and the harassing that happens in the sort of 3 months leading up to an election. And then it does go quiet. There's no doubt the intensification of an election cycle kind of wanes, and then maybe you're getting canvassed or you're getting leaflets every now and again. But people would be forgiven for kind of just thinking that that's my councillor now, and then forgetting, and they wouldn't even realise that a co-option's happened and someone else has come in. So, you know, that's not on the individual for not knowing that. So I found myself right up until the 2024 local elections, when I was knocking on doors and banging on doors looking for votes, people saying, where's Rebecca gone? You know? And I was saying, Rebecca's been in the Shannon the last 4 years. So, but look, that's just the nature of politics. The onus is on us to get out and meet people. Yeah. And certainly during that initial period, during COVID, it was very hard, and really, you know, there's a group of constituents, and they're probably in every ward and they're in every constituency, who are very active, and who, you know, are email campaigning their TDs and their senators and their councillors all the time, and they probably have the council on speed dial, and they probably are more connected to the city council officials in a way. You know, as a councillor, you know, your powers are actually quite limited. You're pulling and pushing the executive management team of either South Dublin County Council or Dublin City Council, in my case, to do things. But there's only really a handful of powers we have, votes we can actually, you know, exert leverage on the officials. So, like, there's resident associations who'd be more connected to the officials than some councillors. You know, they'd have long-standing relationships about different bits and pieces, whereas the community cleanups or planning issues or whatever. So there's that cohort of people who are really active and who know everything. Then there's a kind of peel around them who are you know, a bit more active. So they might be occasionally picking up the phone to their councillor about double yellow lines or bins not being collected on time or trees growing in their garden. And then there's like other people who are in need of help, really in need of help, and they probably don't know where to go to get it. So that was something that I found really hard to navigate in that initial kind of COVID period. There was so many people who were just being missed, who were probably living in really difficult situations, who needed representation. And I find it now when I'm out knocking on doors or canvassing, like you meet someone and they say, oh my God, this issue just happened to me last week. Any chance you can help me with it? My daughter's after being rejected for medical priority on the housing list, or, this severe sort of housing maintenance issue has happened in my home, or whatever it might be. I need assistance accessing medical cards for my disabled granddaughter, whatever it might be. And you've just because you've knocked on that door within that distance of that happening, they go, oh, I can reach out to you for help. I didn't even think of that,
Yeah.
So that during COVID, there would have been a lot of those people missed, I think, by politics, So I certainly found that as a new councillor, there was people I just wasn't getting to. So to go back to your question, it was very hard to kind of engage with the wider community. As I mentioned, there was that core who's very active, they're on the phone to you. They're following the co-options. They know exactly who their councillors are, and they're on to you about their issues, and it's great, it's fantastic to have those people. They're very committed, they're very passionate about their communities. But then there's whole swathes of the community maybe who aren't connected politically, and it's important that we include them in the conversation.
Yeah, no, and that's good that, you're not forgetting about for lack of a better term, the little guy, or maybe the person that is just maybe doesn't know that there is that service.
The help is out there.
That connection to get help. So I think that's good, and that's probably what being a counsellor is probably all about.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, I suppose you get into the work of being a counsellor. Your inbox is hopping, your phone is hopping. I made the decision at the very beginning of becoming a local representative of having the same phone. So I don't have two phones. So when I get a phone call, I don't know, what it's going to be. I don't know if it's about my, my own personal life, or whether it's a political issue, or a constituent who needs a bit of a dig out. So there's a kind of spectrum of queries that come up. There's the kind of, without kind of boxing people into boxes, there's the kind of superficial stuff around, the grass hasn't been cut, the trees haven't been pruned, the double yellow lines are fading, there's dog poo on the street, which obviously has bigger hygienic issues if you're a wheelchair user, you're pushing a pram into your house. So there's stuff like that that should be just done, that isn't done, and you kind of like the council getting to those issues on a rolling basis, but sometimes they need a nudge to say that needs to be prioritised, or that hasn't been done in years. So that type of stuff is all the time, it's constant, Then there's like really complicated cases, like really difficult housing situations. And, they might be in really dire need of help, and they just haven't got themselves on the right track yet to even begin. Like they're in such desperate need of guidance. They tell you I'm living in a one bed and I have, two kids, and we're all sharing, and there's, my child is getting sick, and we're all getting sick whenever, because we're all in the same room. And and you're like, okay, have you got on the transfer list? Have you done this? Have you done that? And they're kind of like, well, no, I only moved in here last year, but then my partner came home and she had, whatever it might be. And you're like, oh, well, you're actually not eligible to even get on the transfer list until this time. And then once you do, you're going to go to the back of a very long queue because our housing situation is just so catastrophic at the moment, Yeah. So with those people who are obviously in need of urgent help, you're just signposting them towards where they can eventually get help. But just because the system is so overwhelmed, there's actually in practice quite little you can do for those people. And those are really hard cases because, had they known earlier what to do, they might have got themselves in the queue earlier. And it's so horrific to even talk about accessing basic public services such as housing by forming a queue, but that's unfortunately what we have. And so you're constantly kind of navigating all these different issues that are coming at you. I'm just giving you kind of basic, bog standard double yellow lines, housing crisis. There's other stuff then, like, local schools might need access to amenities. There might be issues around road safety, kids getting to school safe. We want to encourage people to walk and cycle, but like there's this mad junction that's just, out of kilter, and we need to get the traffic engineers to make it safer. There's just a whole range of issues. You could fill your days and fill your hours just getting back to queries that need urgent care, but you have to prioritise your time, because I mentioned at the start, we're part-time, we have full-time jobs, we have other lives outside of that, we've families, we've loved ones, we've I'm a St. Patrick's Athletic season ticket holder, trying to get as many games as I can. I don't get as many away games as I like to now because you have to prioritise.
Oh, yeah.
But, we've lives as well. But you have to kind of triage issues as they're coming into you, which is just a horrible thing to even say. But as a councillor in particular, you don't have the administrative support of an office, of staff, of anything like that. It's just when people ring me and say, am I through to the office of Darragh Moriarty? I'm like, no, you're through to me. It's just me.
Make an appointment with your assistant.
Yeah. Like I'm the assistant, I'm the secretary, I'm the everything. So it can be overwhelming at times, but I think I've learned over the years, it's kind of mad to say, look, I'm a public representative now, 6 years, June 2020, June 2026 now. So like it's kind of mad to look back at it. I think I've learned to kind of cope, and you can't, unfortunately, I can't get back to everybody within days of them contacting me, and you kind of you end up saying I'll get back to them, and then you kind of put it in this list of priority to get back to, and then other stuff comes in that's really urgent, and then I could be 2-3 weeks, could be a month getting back to someone and saying I'm so sorry, but what's happened since I was last in touch with you? Bring me up to speed. And then okay, what did you do since I was, you got in touch, and then I'll kind of navigate them from there. So, but yeah, like it's you have to have. I always try and think of like where can I have the most amount of impact, and like it's funny because politics is all local and you have to be responding. And there's these people who put you on an email with all the other councillors, and then it's kind of. They'll send a follow-up 2 days later. Thanks to A and B for getting back to me, but nobody else got back to me, And you're going, okay, it was just about a tree, needing to be cut. Like, so it's just, you have to just prioritise who really needs your help sometimes.
Yeah, I get that, yeah. Sounds like, it sounds definitely like part-time job, full-time commitment.
Yeah.
And so with the Liberties being in your ward, like what makes the Liberties such a unique place, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Liberties people, they are incredible, and I'd be very quick to point out that I'm not from the Liberties itself. I'm from Dolphin's Barn, which is right on the edge of the Liberties. But I mean, I would have spent a lot of time in Maryland. I would have spent a lot of time in Marble Lane and Vicar Street as a kid, and I remember the kind of sense of community and commonality and sort of the sense of togetherness, because there was an awful lot of neglect in that community, and people living in really difficult circumstances had to make the best of what they had. And I think that's formed a character to that community that's kind of lasted decades. And, I would have grown up around that and in that, and sort of, I remember kind of participating in football tournaments as a kid. I would have been part of the Maryland team, would have played against Marble Lane, Vicar Street, Oliver Bond, James's Street, would have had these tournaments in the summer and just played football, and just, all these different people from all these different backgrounds coming together, but they were all kind of unified by this connection to the Liberties, and that's still there. It's under threat. It's under threat, definitely. I suppose if your listeners know that part of Dublin well, the kind of the opening up of Cork Street, if you used to get a bus down Dolphin's Barn, Cork Street, you'd swing a left and go down the old Coombe, and then they opened it all up now, and you go straight down towards Patrick Street now on the big wide road. So you kind of bypass Liberties. But a lot of inward investment, I think, kind of towards the end of the Celtic Tiger era, kind of 2000s. A lot of investment in new kind of apartment schemes, which are great. We need housing in the area. And I think more recently, if you think back to the last 10 years in particular, coming out of the recession and coming out of the kind of recovery of the recession and the housing crisis starting to really bite, there was a lot of focus put on, just get houses built, just get everything built, and a lot of build to rents came into the Liberties. Dublin 8 was so proximate to town and so on top of the city centre that, investors started looking at Dublin 8. So you get all these big apartment blocks, and I don't have an issue with height, I don't have an issue with big apartment blocks, but I have an issue with affordability, and I have an issue with people from the local area actually being able to see a future for themselves in that area and afford to buy some of these or rent some of these homes. And the other one was student accommodation. Really big issue with student accommodation, luxury student accommodation, because we are on the edge of Dublin city centre. We're more or less, I mean, it's all relative, I would say we're not in town. You might say we are in town, being up here. But I think, it's all relative. So student accommodation started to come along. And I always feared that was a vehicle towards visitor accommodation and towards sort of tourist accommodation. And, you know, they got planning permissions left, right and centre for kind of off-peak times of student time. So basically from sort of May right through to October, they let out these student accommodation beds to tourists. And look, tourists are a vital part of the economy. I represent an area that has the Guinness Storehouse and Kilmainham Jail in it, so I want people to visit Dublin. But there has to be balance. And I think the Liberties certainly felt the pinch of that investment coming in, not for that community, but kind of pushing that community aside. And we had to fight back on that, and particularly kind of the student accommodation and the hotels. Hotels was a really, really big one. But I think there's also another side to investment in our community. And I think more recently we've seen Dublin City Council invest in Francis Street, for example. Like, you know, the public realm in Francis Street looks fantastic now if anybody's walked down it or been there recently. Meat Street's currently getting a facelift. So Meat Street's currently going through a public realm enhancement programme. Thomas Street, where we're investing in kind of the shop fronts and the businesses there to make them look the part, in keeping with kind of, you know, the heritage of the Liberties. So like there's investment like that that's happening that some people would say is supporting gentrification. I see that as just investing in the community. That's investment that hasn't been happening for so long that people are going, what's all this about? You're just trying to make it look nice now for the tourists. I'm saying, well, we're just trying to make it look nice for everybody, the people who live here and the tourists, you know?
Yeah.
So there's definitely 100% grievance there, and people have a right to feel aggrieved at the preponderance of tourist and visitor accommodation, student accommodation, really, you know, not what that community needs in terms of, you know, people living in really overcrowded flats, you know, people living in Pimlico and Marble Lane and School Street and Oliver Bond and Emmett Buildings and Cook Street flats, all these different flats that have families, you know, living chic by jail in these tiny, really cramped, dated flats. And they're sitting there thinking, you know, my daughter deserves to get out and have a life for herself. And instead of that, you're building €3,000 a month built to rent apartments next to me. Or you're building, you know, luxury co-living developments. So there's a real sense of, you know, who is this for? It's not for us, you know? And I think that's well documented. And I think, you know, we as people now representing that community have to respond to that. And I suppose for my part, I would have been focusing on what can we do through planning restrictions and planning regulations to try and limit the number of hotels that we're seeing. Also short-term lets, you know, we see people who own houses in the Dublin area renting them out on Airbnb and platforms like that. I just had a complaint yesterday or this week about a house in the Tenters, which is glossily advertised on Airbnb, a full house, you know, that should be part of the solution to our housing crisis, instead being used for short-term lets. So that's a real issue as well. So that sense that there's actors within our community, you know, who don't have its best interests at heart. And they're not really for the people who live there. So that's a real issue. And I think, you know, we have to, if we don't respond to that, if we don't bring that community with us and listen to what they're saying, you know, they'll turn off politics, they'll turn off engaging, they'll turn off picking the phone up and articulating what's wrong. And I think, you know, what we're seeing, particularly in some working class communities that are being, you know, who are getting fed the narrative you're being left behind, we see a real kind of nasty element coming in to try and take advantage of that grievance. So if we don't respond to it positively, we'll sort of push them towards other elements. And I think that's something I'm really concerned about as a progressive politician, is making sure that those communities feel listened to, those communities feel supported, and that we're listening to them as part of the solution.
Yeah, and I can see that maybe with some people feel they get left behind. Let's say they're not getting listened to by some sections, then they might drift more on the side that's a bit more hateful, a bit more, you know, pointing fingers, anti-politics
in general.
Anti-politics, yeah. Don't trust the government. Yeah. Don't trust the councillors, which is like, well, they're there to actually help you run the community and stuff. So
yeah, and I think that's not unique to the Liberties, by the way. You know, It's happening all over the country, unfortunately, and it's definitely something in my time on Dublin City Council and as somebody who's running for office, as somebody who stood also in a general election. You know, I think I've seen that real nasty edge come into politics, and you know, I've definitely stood up and fought back against this, and I've done so kind of possibly in hindsight. Maybe I've fallen into some of their traps. I think your listeners might be familiar with kind of the tricolours getting hung up all over Dublin, and that was something I very forcefully went out against and called for the removal of, that they were being put up without permission. They were essentially litter. And I don't like calling my own tricolour litter, but I was more focused on the intent of the people who were putting it up. And in hindsight, I've kind of taken a different view, which is kind of rushing out and having council staff up poles, taking down tricolours would have given those agitators the exact visual they wanted.
Right, yeah.
They would have been filming it. So it was a trap that they set that I probably fell into in the first
Damned
instance.
if you do, damned if you don't. Yeah.
And I think I've learned now that the tricolours aren't the issue. It's it's what they're a symptom of. You know what I mean? It's what they represent. It's what's going on in communities that people feel the need to reclaim their part of the community. From who, from what. You know what I mean? So I think that's the issue we need to get to the underbelly of. And that starts by listening to communities. It starts by supporting them. It starts by resolving the big issues. I mean, housing is obviously the top one. We live in a society now in Ireland where there's 17,000 people living in homeless emergency accommodation. It's shameful. We have politicians, leaders in this country, Micheál Martin, Simon Harris, talking about how, well, yes, those numbers are high, but it's actually a lot of people who aren't from Ireland who are actually contributing to that. And you're thinking how grossly and utterly irresponsible that is. I think Simon Harris went as far as to say some of these people don't even have a right to be in Ireland. And
Bait.
Yeah. And the director of the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, so the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, for your listeners, is responsible for running homelessness services all over the 4 Dublin local authorities. So it's Fingal, it's Dublin City Council, it's South Dublin County Council, and it's Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown. Obviously, it's massively concentrated in DCC, but a lot up in South Dublin as well. But she came out very strongly and said, anybody who's in Ireland who has a right to be here is who we support. But when you have that type of, it's not our fault homelessness is on the rise. And I mean, even only this week, the housing minister said he has no plan for when he will see the homelessness number start to reduce. I mean, if that's the housing minister, what is on your priority list, mate? If it's not bringing down homelessness, and he doesn't even have because I suppose they've been going up month on month on month. And I mean, the homeless charities, and I used to work in the homeless sector. The homeless charities have said, we're rapidly racing towards 20,000 people in homeless emergency accommodation.
Wow.
And those questions have been asked of our decision makers, what are you going to do about it? And he just doesn't have an answer to say it's going to start falling off by this date because we've this much housing in the pipeline or whatever. So, look, I think there's actors in our communities trying to point the fingers at other people and say it's their fault, it's the government, it's the foreigner, it's the refugee, it's the tech worker, it's the whoever. It is the government, it's government failing. It's a decade and a half of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in power who just haven't gotten to grips with the housing crisis. And I think it, and not only housing, like public services in general, creaking. I think people will be familiar with kind of disability services and access to assessments of need and SNA pressure and school places and all of that. I mean, the health system, and I just think people will know all these creaks in our systems that we have, and they will yet hear the country's awash with billions in surpluses, and they just go, add up how we have this level of financial resources and yet all these problems, so and I think the neck of anybody in power to point and say it's actually the black and brown people's fault we have a housing crisis, or it's the black and brown people's fault that we have people in homeless emergency accommodation. I think it's their fault,
So it's kind of like scapegoating for systematic failures and systematic inertia, maybe.
Definitely.
To some extent.
I couldn't have put that sentence better. 100%.
Yeah, I think it is quite insidious, and you think, well, actually it's they're the problem. And you're like, well, and then people who might be more inclined to believe it, will be like, you know what, you're right. And it kind of makes a cycle of hate.
Yeah,
almost.
and I don't want to I suppose I don't want to give off the impression to anybody listening that racism is new in Ireland. Like, racism has probably always been there.
Sure.
There's always been an element of society that's comfortable sort of talking in those terms about other people coming in, and they've always been there probably, but I definitely feel there's a higher level of comfort now for people to start having those conversations, and that didn't used to be there. You know, I'm very fortunate to have gone to a school that was multi-ethnic, multiracial, right the way up from primary school to secondary school. I would have shared classrooms with people from all over Europe, from all over the world, and you know, my knowledge of the world is richer and more enhanced because of that. And there's definitely, you know, if you look at schools now, you look at sports teams, you look at, you know, our football team, you look at our Olympic team, there's people from all backgrounds, and that's to be celebrated and nurtured and supported. You look at our hospitals, they wouldn't function without people from overseas. So hospitality, every sector, you know, and I think for people to kind of be more emboldened and brash about openly talking about Ireland for the Irish and all this type of nonsense, it's so important that progressives, you know, we in the Labour Party, you know, working with others of the left, hang together and really do fight that back. And just in the last 2 weeks, my own colleague in Galway, Helen Ogbu, became the mayor of Galway, the first black woman to do so. And I think those positive signals of people who have come to this country, who make an enormous contribution to this country, being visible and being seen in our politics is so important. If you look at our Dáil, you know, with the exception maybe of Leo Varadkar, who came from an Indian background, there's probably nobody who's come from migrant background in Dáil Éireann. And I think it's so important that if you think of the proportion of our population who comes from a migrant background, that's not represented in our politics. It's really, really important that those voices break through, that we hear their experience and that they contribute to our politics as well as our society.
Yeah, no, spot on. And Nick, they are people who live in Ireland. They're Irish people.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't they be represented?
Yeah, and I suppose you've started this segment, I suppose, talking about the Liberties, and I don't mean to bring back to the Liberties as being a potential, you know, feeding ground for that type of politics to take hold. The Liberties is an incredible place. There's so many strong community activists who have been doing incredible work on the ground there for decades long, and they'd be the very first people in line to run any people trotting far-right nonsense out of their flat complexes and running them out of their communities. And I think we have to work with those activists on the ground to make sure that when they speak about lack of investment, neglect, regenerations getting stopped, when they speak about those issues, we have to be there to respond, because if we're not there listening, not there engaging, there's vacuums, and I think vacuums are dangerous.
Yeah, and obviously I know we started talking about the Liberties, but I think it's just that it's everywhere now, that there's not one area or one place in Ireland that's untouched by a lot of, you know, anti-migrant, anti-whatever, anti-this, like anti-not Irish, or anti just everything. It's very strange. It's hard to put into words.
They kind of have there's a basket of everything they're anti. They're anti-migrant, they're anti-trans, you know, they're anti this, that, and the other. And I just think they're such a small but loud, you know, group. And I think the big thing as well is, and I'm not kind of just, you know, blaming the social media companies, but a big issue is how much in this country we consume US and UK media and social media, and some of the culture wars that are ongoing in those countries, they kind of get imported here. And you know, like, I think the most ridiculous possible image I can remember is Irish nationalists, so-called Irish patriots, you know, arm in arm with lads waving Union Jacks, calling for, you know, the white supremacy, basically. And you're thinking, you know, you're an Irish nationalist and you're arm in arm with Tommy Robinson and the fashion in the UK. So I just think people don't know their history, and I think there's the kind of conversation now that's happening, and you hear the Fine Gael line, which is, you know, we need to be firm but fair on migration and all this nonsense. You know, there's just this sense of inevitability that it happened in Italy, it happened in Spain, it happened in Germany, it happens in France. You know, these far-right parties are on the rise and they're going to get into power, and we have to kind of lean in a little bit and be a bit anti-migrant to kind of keep them out. You know, Spain I mentioned there, like there was a real sense of inevitability that Vox, a far-right neo-fascist party, was going to sort of be knocking on the door of government. And now we have Pedro Sanchez, a kind of socialist, and like absolutely unapologetic socialist, who is standing there and he's saying, people are welcome in this country. There's a huge history of North Africans migrating into Spain, obviously the geographical proximity and everything else. And they're regularising a lot of people who are kind of hidden in the shadows, who are possibly, you know, what some people might call quote unquote illegal migrants, but they've been there for years. They contribute, they work, they keep agriculture going, they keep hospitality going, they keep construction going, which is really, really important. And he's actually opened the door for them to say, you can become a Spanish citizen. And he's pushing back the far right in that respect. So this sense of inevitability that's happening all over Europe, we are going to have some sort of migration politics issue here. I don't think it's inevitable at all. And I think specifically in Ireland, with our history of being colonised, with our history of sending people all over the world. I mean, I have family in Australia, I have family in Canada, I have family in South Africa. I'm sure if you ask any Irish person, they have family all over the world. So I think the neck of people to say, you can't come here when we've trodden on every footpath around the world is galling. So I don't think there's any sense of inevitability that, you know, anti-migrant politics has to take hold here. I think there's a handful of gobshites, frankly, who are in the Dáil who might, you know, espouse anti-immigrant rhetoric, but largely it's been kept out of the Dáil and it's only being parroted now by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. There are some far-right councillors on councils around the country, including on Dublin City Council. And you know, that's just the reality, but they haven't broken into national politics yet. And I don't think there's any sense of inevitability that they will or should.
Yeah, because you see, obviously, everything kind of swinging right around the world. America, and then a lot of parties in Europe. And you're thinking, oh, are we next? Are we so special that we won't shift this far right?
Some people say that. So I've heard that, you know, what's so exceptional about Ireland, but I think I've just said it. I think our history, our understanding of colonialism, our, you know, being under the foot of the British Empire for centuries, watching, you know, grossly racist far-right actors in the UK arm in arm with Irish patriots, you know, so-called, is laughable. And I think the only thing we can do is laugh at that, point at it and say, look at the state of that. Because that's all it's justified, you know, when people start doing that. So, and that's not to dismiss very real grievances and pressures that communities are under. You know, there's no doubt, hesitation, question mark in my mind that there are parts of this country where things are working much better and there are parts of this country where they're bursting and they're under pressure and they need investment and they need resources. And they've been starved of those resources for years. And parts of Dublin 8 certainly fall into that category. And parts of, you know, the wider Dublin South Central area, which would I be representing as Ballyfermot, Cherry Orchards, parts of Crumlin, they would also really be struggling for some of those resources. So this is not to diminish those very legitimate grievances, but their grievance, in my view, lies with the people who are in power and the people who've been in power for a decade and a half, who've done nothing, who've watched surpluses rise and haven't spent them wisely enough. That's who their anger should be directed at, in my opinion. So it's not to be dismiss the very issues that they have, and that's what I started off this conversation by saying. We have to respond to that. We have to listen to those people. We have to bring those community with us. And we have to make sure that the people who want to finger point at others aren't given a voice, aren't given a space to do so.
You're very vocal, I've seen, about the Oliver Bond flats. So what kind of conditions are the Oliver Bond flats in right now? I think it's quite, the residents are really up against it.
Yeah, well, I think Dublin City Council has the oldest and most antiquated housing stock in the state. Oliver Bond goes back to the 1930s. You know, it's coming up to its 90th anniversary soon, and the conditions there are appalling. You know, I've stood in many of the flats. I've visited so many people that have damp, mould, rat infestations, and apart from those obvious health issues, they're just tiny. They're just cramped. And there's just no quality of life. You have your kitchen and then you have a sitting room area, and like, I remember talking to someone like who like took out one of those lap trays and she's like, this is my dinner table. You know, this is what I have my dinner table. And then she said, I rearranged the whole furniture one day a year, which is Christmas, to sit down and have a proper family meal at Christmas, where we pull the table out from behind the couch. So apart from the living conditions, just the space and the crampedness, And Oliver Bond rightfully gets a lot of focus and attention, but it's just one of many complexes all over Dublin that are in like absolute dire condition. So it's been long overdue to get a regeneration. I have been on the regeneration board of Oliver Bond since it was established in 2021. So we're now into our 5th year of the Oliver Bond Regeneration Board. We've been moving, we've been progressing, it's been slow, but we've been jumping over the different hurdles that the Department of Housing and Local Government put in front of you. We have had setbacks. We've been told those drawings looks a bit messy, go back and redo them. So we did everything the department asked us. And then last December, we submitted a funding application. Here we go, phase 1, blocks L, M and N of Oliver Bond would be the first phase in the regeneration. And at the Minister's direction, the Minister for Housing, James Brown, those plans were rejected. And we got a letter in May of this year to say, basically, we're not funding this current scheme. And the reason we're not funding the scheme, and I suppose it's slightly complicated and architectural, so I don't want to get into the details too much, but essentially, the flats are so small and tiny that in order to bring them up to modern standards, you would basically need to knock 2 into 1.
Right.
So there's currently 391 dwellings in Oliver Bond. 391. It's one of the largest flat complexes in the entire country. If we were to amalgamate them all to bring them up to modern standards, and I have emails, I have presentations going back years when this was the plan. We were moving towards this plan. We recognised we were going to have to take the hit on units. We just couldn't get 400 more flats out of Oliver Bond while bringing it up to modern standards. It just wasn't possible. So if you took the 391, it was going to become roughly 270. So you're taking a big hit on numbers of units, but you are roughly going to come out with similar bed spaces. So you'd lose the number of dwellings, but you'd get the same amount of people housed, if that made sense. That was always the kind of aim. How can we keep the bed spaces more or less similar? And basically, in my view anyway, the Minister made a very firm decision that it was more about the unit numbers. You know, in a housing crisis, he wasn't going to put hundreds of millions into regenerating Oliver Bond to lose houses. And he said as much. So that letter came out and it dropped like a bomb in the community. It's the only way I can describe it. It's just the outcry, the anger, the waste of everyone's time. The last 5 years of pushing this mountain, or pushing this rock up this mountain, and then to kind of just get this rejection letter. This is cold, just not happening letter. So in fairness, the chair of the Oliver Bond Regeneration Forum is a guy called Frank Clark. He's a former Chief Justice of Ireland. He's a former Supreme Court judge. His father grew up just off Francis Street in the Liberties, so he has a good connection to the area. He's very well connected. He sprung into action, and we all sprung into action as councillors, as representatives, including TDs. Fianna Fáil TD included. Catherine Darragh, who's a Fianna Fáil TD for the area, she was very active, I have to say, in pushing her own minister on it. But it really came to a head, I think, when Miriam O'Callaghan and Primetime came out and they did a big special programme on Oliver Bond, and she spent 2 days in the flats. She walked around, she was taken around by the Residents Association, she saw the living conditions, and there was a big Primetime special into it. And honestly, I think that really did make a huge difference in the Minister's mind. And not only the Minister's mind, but the advisors around the Minister, because they don't like Primetime nagging them. So we got a meeting with the Minister, and I'm glad to say it was only reported over the weekend. Phase 1 is back on. We've had to make adjustments to it. And the only way I can describe the adjustments is we essentially had a row about 8 flats. 8. So when you think of the road, like we submitted this in December, they had just came back to us and said, tinker, change those units around. We would have, been annoyed, but we probably would have done it. But instead, to leave us hanging for 5-6 months, rejection, go back to the drawing board. And then we cause a massive fuss. We get a meeting with them, and then it's just, okay, we'll move these units here and there, and you're thinking all that fuss for that, you know? So that's really frustrating. But I think it is back on, which is great. It's really, really positive. I suppose for me, and I think of another flat complex in my area, and listeners might be familiar if they're coming down Crumlin Road, heading towards town. You might pass Dolphin House, which is on your left as you come over Dolphin's Barn Bridge. That complex began regeneration in 2014. The first phase of that was completed in 2016, and that's phase 1. And 0 has happened since then.
Nothing.
So we're now at a stage where we've approved the planning permission for phase 1B, and we're being told that phase 1C is coming, and then DCC and the Land Development Agency are in discussions about a wider master plan to get that back on again. So I'm a little bit scared from the idea of just getting over the hump of phase 1.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame you.
And then saying, what happens next? What happens after that? So while phase 1 is absolutely vital that we get momentum and we get Oliver Bond moving, I really do want to see the wider, bigger master plan. And the Department of Housing and Local Government has made it very, very clear they need additionality. They can't countenance going from 390 to 260. They just can't. They're not accepting it. So we're now looking at imaginative ways in Oliver Bond to see, can we kind of partially demolish some units? Because the thing with Oliver Bond, it's a Herbert Sims original. Who's Herbert Sims? He was the first ever city architect of Dublin City Council back in the 1920s and 30s. And a lot of the big, Pearse House, Markovitz House, some of the big complexes around the city were his brainchild. So in Pearse House, which listeners might know, that is a listed on the record of protected structures building.
Right.
So very limited what they can do there. Very limited from a sort of conservation point of view. Very limited from a conservation point of view. And then you have Oliver Bond, which is regionally significant but not protected. So there's concerns about knocking stuff down because it might, lead to challenges from conservationists and so on. But I think we are looking at partial demolition to try and get the numbers up.
Okay, so there is a solution there.
There's hopefully a solution there. Phase 1 is back on, but I think, as I mentioned with Dolphin House, I'm concerned about just making sure we don't put all the eggs in the phase 1 basket and, lose sight of the bigger, wider picture, that we don't end up in 5 or 6 years' time saying we got phase 1 done, wasn't that great? And everyone else is still living in really dilapidated conditions, So I think it goes to show that if you don't make a huge fuss and push and say this is not right, they'll just try to push you off and ignore you. Because it seems like they wouldn't have even considered then entertaining you unless you made that fuss, because they're trying to parcel you off and try to say no. I know from discussions with kind of maybe political representatives who are more in the know of the advisors around the minister, that certainly they were surprised by the level of backlash. I don't think they thought it was going to come the way it did. I mean, in fairness, I have to hand credit to my own party colleagues in the Dáil, but also Sinn Féin. I think Mary Lou MacDonald, Owen O'Brien, it was brought up in the Oireachtas Housing Committee. It was like the senior officials from the department were being like grilled on Oliver Bond, and rightly so. But I do think the reason it struck such a nerve was because Oliver Bond is universally known to have such dilapidated conditions.
Sure, yeah.
And if you think of city councillors all over the city, if you think of councillors on the north side who are thinking of Ballybock House, if you think of them thinking of, Crome Castle up out the north side, if you think of other people thinking of complexes in their area, they were looking at Oliver Bond going, that's not getting regenerated and that's in such poor condition, what hope does my complex have? So that's why, in fairness, I had a motion on Dublin City Council that was co-signed by every single political party. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, Independents, PBP, Greens. We all co-signed a motion calling on the Minister for Housing to reverse the decision, because we knew the enormity of, if Oliver Bond can't get regenerated, that means all these other complexes are in bother as well. So that's why I think it really struck a nerve. But you're right, if we hadn't made the fuss, if we had just took a line down and gone, okay, well, we'll just go back to the drawing board, we wouldn't have got the dividend that we're getting now by getting phase 1 back on track.
Oh, no, fair play. Anyway, it just goes to show you need to make a big fuss to get stuff done sometimes. And just before we wrap up, Darragh, is there anything kind of you have going on now in the near future, or anything you kind of want to highlight?
Well,
probably a big loaded question.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I really appreciate the conversation. It's gone in many different directions that maybe I didn't think it was going to go in myself. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. I suppose one thing we haven't gotten to, and I don't want to take up too much more time, is sport, which is a huge issue that I'm very passionate about. I chair Dublin City Council's Community, Gaeilge, Culture, Sport Committee. And we have Dublin City Council's first ever sports plan, and we're kind of driving through the kind of different objectives and goals of that plan. And I think the biggest issue for us, and it's kind of interesting coming up here to South Dublin, because the biggest issue for us in an inner city community is space, and its provision of green space and parks and pitches is a huge, huge issue. And the explosion we've had, which is fantastic, in girls and women playing sport has put even more pressure on those facilities. And it just means that we're so deficient, we're so space poor. With so many people who want to play, who want to organise, who want to get out and kick a ball or throw a ball or catch a ball or whatever. And we really are bursting with waiting lists and interest in pitches. And a big, big thing I've fought for in my own community, you know, having been sports mad growing up and having playing for clubs, you know, I had to leave Dublin 8 and go to Dublin 12. I had to go to Sundrive Park, I had to go to Brickfield Park. That's where the whole of Dublin 8 decamped to play sport. And that put pressure on their facilities, because, you know, you think of Drimney, you think of Kimmage and Crumlin, you know, they have teams that want to use those facilities, and yes, you have all this pressure coming in from outside their communities that they might see it. So we really did take the fight to get new, big, full-size pitches in the Dublin 8 area, and thankfully, I've been part of pushing 2 sites along. There's one on the North Avenue, which is coming. That should be done by the end of next year, and then there's one coming in Marylebone Lane, which is an old Dublin City Council depot land. So you'll have 2 brand new full-size pitches within very short distance. I think they'll be the most used pitches in the entire country because of the demand that's there from GAA clubs, from rugby clubs, from soccer clubs. So that's a really, really important issue that I'm passionate about. And I mentioned earlier on, we were talking about kind of what brings people together. Sport really does. Yeah. And I think if you look at, you know, the Irish football team, the rugby team, our women's team, people from different backgrounds, different nationalities, it's something that can be a unifying force, and giving people space to come together to play is really, really important. And so many of our communities in inner city Dublin are really lacking those spaces. So yeah, sport, community infrastructure, community space is a huge issue for me. And as chair of that committee and as a local representative for that area, they're 2 things I'm really passionate about driving. Yeah, no, well said. And it's good that we need spaces for kids to play, you know, because it does seem quite sparse. It still seem quite sparse now. The inner cities, it's just obviously more intensive development happening, and land is so much more lucrative because, you know, if you're doing a massive housing development and you want to carve out a full-size GAA pitch, you know, the dimensions of that are just so land intensive and land hungry that, you know, you get developers and officials saying, would you not take a soccer pitch because it's 2/3 the size of a GAA pitch? And they go, no, because where do the GAA clubs go then? And, you know, so you're constantly fighting for that space, and they're not making new space. You know, if it gets built on, it's gone. Yeah. So that's where the North Avenue came along and has been fought for by councillors before me, and we've kind of taken it on, and thankfully are making waves there. But the Marylebone Lane site, that was a secondary site where we said, if this gets built on, there is literally nothing else in Dublin 8. There's nowhere else we would ever be able to put a green space or a pitch. So we fought at the back of St. Catherine's Community Centre. We're going to have a pitch kind of tucked up against that. So you're going to have a co-location of a community centre and a sports pitch, which I think makes sense. And yeah, we really did take the fight on. It was a rezoning fight. I mean, if your listeners are interested in the detail of it, there was a fight about rezoning the land, and we have the leverage I mentioned earlier on. There's only so many powers we have as councillors. One of them is zoning. And we get to vote on that. So we forced through a zoning there that gave us the bargaining power to negotiate for a pitch. And that will be coming on Marylebone Lane. It's going to be slow. It's not going to happen overnight. The North Avenue will get delivered first, and then we'll continue to work on Marylebone Lane. But I think if I was to look back on my time and any contribution I would have made as a local representative to have been part of delivering 2 full-size pitches in Dublin 8, it'd be something I'd be really, really delighted to have done, because I know myself living in that community, the lack of those facilities and the damage that does. You know, if you don't have those green spaces, what are people doing instead? Yeah, absolutely. Well done. And yeah, so that was a really good chat. So look, thanks so much for coming in. Thanks for having me. We've covered a lot of stuff. A lot of ground. Really appreciate your time. No problem. You too, Darragh. Cheers. Thanks for listening to the 7th episode of Talking with Patrick.